Hi, welcome back to uh, history terminology. And today we're going to be talking about basic economic terms. So the basic things that you need to know so you can understand what they're talking about in like a history book when they start talking about economic things. So let's get started. And the first thing we're going to talk about is different economic systems. Now this isn't a totally inclusive list, but these are kind of the major ones that you're probably going to come across in your average high school history class. So we're going to talk about each one of these. The first one is called bartering, and that's when goods and services are just traded between individuals. So, that's like I'm a farmer, I make corn, I'm going to trade my corn with the guy who makes clothes. We're going to kind of argue about what's worth what, and then we'll trade. That's bartering. Mercantilism is the economic theory that trade generates wealth and it involves protectionism. And that's the kind of economics that was in place during the colonial era, the beginning of the colonial era. All the European powers made colonies so that they could have all the different things they needed and the trade they needed so they could trade all within themselves to generate wealth. Capitalism is what we currently have in the United States. And that is the free market controls price through supply and demand. And there's more to it than that, but that's the general gist of what it is. Socialism is when community owned and regulated production and distribution of goods. So there isn't really a truly socialistic government right now in the world, but there's parts of it. It's called like a mixed economy. So there's some that's community owned and a lot of regulation. And that's what keeps the economy going. Communism is supposed to be a class war that leads to a public ownership of all property. It doesn't end up being that way. Most communist economies are basically just command economies, which means that the leadership of the country tells everybody what to do, and that's how production is managed. Distributism is that the world's assets should be more widely owned instead of concentrated. And basically, that's just a knock against the concentration of wealth and power into a small group of hands. So it's basically like anti-oligopoly for distributism. Statism is that the government has a substantial central control over economic affairs, and this is more what communist economies look like. It's more of a statist economy than a actual communist economy. Feudalism is the economic system in which nobles traded military strength for land, and this was around in the Middle Ages when the king would provide certain things to nobles, like land and power, and the nobles would provide their military strength, and then the people underneath the nobles would provide something to them, and the nobles would say, "We'll protect you." So it was kind of an economy built through alliances. And then finally, mutualism is the kind of a socialist society based on the free market, and it's mostly libertarian in viewpoint. That one's not really around. It's something that's advocated for by people, but it's not really anything that actually happens currently. So here are some modern economic terms. So the things that you're going to need to know for like modern day economic talk whenever anybody's talking about the economy. The first one being GDP, or gross domestic product. And that's just the total value of goods and services produced in a nation over the course of a year. So that's basically like they add up every single thing that's bought and sold in the entire country for the year, and they add up all that value, and that's the gross domestic product. There's an official equation for that, but I don't have it written down here. That's okay. You just need to know what it is. Inflation is the idea that prices increase over time, right? So back in 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, things weren't as expensive. And now they are more expensive. That's just what inflation is, right? As time goes on, price increases. Currency, that's like the paper, coinage, whatever it is that is given value by a nation. So that technically can be anything. In the early days of the United States, everything was based off of gold. Now it's based off of faith, right? So we have faith that our money is worth something, and that's why it has value. So that can change. Property are things that belong to an individual, and there's lots of different things that can be property. And it can be private or public, right? Private property being owned by an individual or like a corporation, public meaning that it's owned by the government. Services are just a transaction where no physical goods are exchanged. So in that sense, right, that could be like you go to get a massage and you get a massage. That's a service. Or you go to like a movie. You get to watch the movie. That's a service, right? Or a show, right? That's a service. Products are a physical good that can be purchased, so that would be like buying a DVD or going to the grocery store and buying food, right? Those are products. Those are things that you can purchase in a store. Supply is the amount of a product or service available, so the amount of it that's been created. And then demand, right, is the amount of product or service needed to satisfy the people's needs. And those two things determine the price of all goods in a capitalist or market economy. Terms of trade. So nations and people trade with each other all the time, and so it's always good to know a little bit about those things. The first thing you're going to want to know is what's called a tariff, and a tariff is just a tax or duty to be paid on a particular class of imports. So, for instance, the government can say, we don't want foreign countries to be able to sell their cheaper cars here at cheaper prices than American cars, so we'll put a tariff on those vehicles. And that artificially raises the price on those cars because now they have to pay this tax to sell it in America. And that makes it easier for American car companies to compete. That's what a tariff is. A free trade zone is an area where there are no trade barriers, so you can't have tariffs in between. There's currently a free trade zone between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. That's called NAFTA. There's a free trade zone in Europe. The EU is a free trade zone, right? There's free trade zones in a lot of different places. The World Trade Organization is an international organization that was created to promote fair and equal trade amongst nations. They do have the power to punish people who don't follow the rules. They have a court system. They do all sorts of different things. An import is just something that's being brought into a country, right? So if I was buying a car from Japan or from Italy or something like that, that would be an import. So I'm bringing it from another country to here. And then an export is something being sent to another country. So if I wanted to sell Fords, right, and I sold them in Europe, that would be an export. So I would build it here and then send it over there and sell it there. So that's an export. An embargo is a blockage of trade. So for a long time, Cuba was embargoed during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and basically we stopped any boats from getting to Cuba because we didn't want them to get certain things. That's a blockage of trade. And then a sanction is a more modern day thing where a punishment that stops trade or aid. It sometimes can be a fine, and that can be given out by an organization like the World Trade Organization or the UN, or individual nations can place sanctions on people, stuff like that. Some other important economic terms you're going to need to know about. One being the consumer, which is someone who purchases a good or a service. So you are a consumer if you buy things. Bankruptcy is when you legally declare that you're out of money, and there are certain rules that go into that. Can nations be bankrupt? Yes, that can happen, and there's laws and ways that works too. Credit is borrowing money, so you can borrow money from the bank. There's actually a World Bank that's run by the World Trade Organization. The World Bank's run independently, where nations can borrow money. So credit, right, is borrowing buying power. Capital is the amount of money or the market value of the means of production, right? So your capital could be the fact that you own a factory. That's a capital. Or it could be the money in your bank account. That's also capital, right? It's just the amount of money that you have. Debt is just money owned to a lender. So if you did borrow money, say you got some credit from a bank, right, you then owe them money. That's a debt. Labor is the amount of physical, mental, or social effort to produce goods. So for instance, right, if you work in a factory, right, you'd be providing physical labor to the factory. So that's labor. Profit is the amount of money made over costs, right? So that's the amount of money you make in excess of the costs it takes to run your business. And then finally, a recession is when the economy is shrinking, right? There's less being produced, there's less money being exchanged. That's a recession. Thank you so much for watching this history terminology video. Can't wait to see you guys in the next one. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time for more learning.